Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H event space. Tony Gale joining us once again. Today, we're finding out what his go-to lenses are. So if you guys do have any questions about lenses in general, or if you want to let us know what your go-to lenses are, feel free to do so in the YouTube chat. Huge thank you to Sony for hosting today's event. So Tony, I will say welcome and
Thank
take it
you.
away.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. I am Tony Gale. I'm a Sony Artisan of Imagery. And as I always say on these, I want to thank B&H and Sony for having me. Without both of them, I wouldn't be here. So today I'm going to be going over my go-to lenses. The last thing I did with B&H in the event space was choosing a lens. This is more subjective because it's the lenses that I use the most. Plus, I have a secondary, the ones I use less most, but still frequently. So we're going to go over that. As I mentioned, I'm a Sony Artisan of Imagery, so all of my lenses are Sony. There's reasons for that. They're good, for example. Also upcoming with me, we have 3 photo walks. So if you're in the New York area or planning to be, September 12th, we're doing a portrait photo walk in Lower Manhattan. September 30th, we're doing portraits with strobes. And October 7th, we're doing a portrait photo walk in Dumbo. I think the first 2 are on the B&H Event Space website now, and the third one should be up shortly. Aside from that, there's a ton of other cool stuff that Sony and the B&H Event Space are doing. Garrett and Amber Baird's wedding film mastery programs coming up. Bird photography with Mahesh, Nancy Borowick's live mentor series. Autumn Schrock is doing lens filters. Jean Fruth is doing 10 images, 10 stories. She has some great stories. A bunch of cool stuff. It's all worth the price of admission, which is free. So check it out if you're interested. I also always like to mention the Alpha Universe community on alphauniverse.com. It's free to be a member and it's friendly. And if you have questions, it's a good place to ask them or to share work or anything you'd like. And then alphauniverse.com itself, which is a great website to just learn about both Sony and photography in general. Even if you don't use Sony, there's still going to be tips and useful things and inspiration. There's the Sony Alpha Female Plus Facebook group. Every week, they do a $500 micro grant based around a specific theme. The recent one was portraiture, I think. You do not need to identify as female to be a member of the group, and you do not need to identify as female to win the micro grant. So you do have to be nice, though, on the page. Don't be a mean person, and you'll be fine. There's also Sony Imaging Pro support, which I'm actually going to mention a little bit, probably. If you shoot professionally, you don't have to be full-time, but you do have to make some money from photography. It's $100 a year. It gets you three free complimentary. That's the same, free and complimentary. 3 complimentary clean-in checks with up to 2 items per year, and they'll pay shipping both ways. It gets you discounted repairs. It gets you expedited repairs. Get you loaners if the repair can't come in time. It's a really great program for $100 a year. And then there's currently a bunch of stuff on sale. So when I looked last week, it said this sale was still going to be happening. So I assume it's true when I made these screenshots. However, if you're watching this in the future, the prices are going to change. There's a bunch of really great stuff on sale, a lot of rebates. And as I mentioned last time, there's a summer trade-in, trade-up program. It looks like that's through September 30th. So if you have a working interchangeable lens digital camera body, you can trade it in, get the value of your trade-in at B&H, plus a Sony bonus. The bonus depends on what you're buying. But if you've been looking to switch to Sony, it's worth looking at. And there's specific cameras that get you an additional bonus. So all that information is on the B&H website. Also, I'm going to mention this a little bit later, but Sony just last week announced the 85 1.4 GA Master 2 lens. People have been waiting for this a long time. It's faster, lighter, sharper than the original. Partly the original G Master 1.4 was one of the very first G Master lenses. So that was 7 years ago, 8 years ago. So this has been updated, so it'll do the 120 frames a second on the Alpha 9 III, for example. Really great lens. I got to play with it a little bit last week. All right, so I'm a commercial photographer based here in New York City. I mostly shoot people and portraits. Let's go over some lenses. So my go-to lenses are what I use. There's a ton of options out there. There's 70-ish, I'm not sure the number exactly, Sony E-mount lenses. So there's a lot of options out there. But we're all different photographers and different things work for different people. So I'm going over my go-to lenses. I'll talk about why I chose most of those lenses. Maybe that resonates with you and it makes sense. Maybe a different lens makes sense. I'm not saying this is what you should do. It's just what I do. So I mentioned I mostly photograph people and portraits. I do travel landscape stuff for fun. So those are the kinds of lenses that I gravitate towards. So for example, the 600 f4, fantastic lens. I love it. I don't own that lens because I just don't need that kind of focal length and speed that often. There are things I do where it would be useful, but it's not the right lens for me. At least at this time, you never know. Next week could be different, but it's a great lens. All right, let's start with my main go-to lenses. So I have 1635 f4G power zoom, 2470 2.8G master 2, 24105 f4G, 70 to 200 2.8G master 2, 200 600G, 35G master 40 compact, 51.2G master 8518. So I'm going to go through this individually, explain why I picked him, and show some examples. We'll start with the Sony FEPZ 1635 f4G. So the 1635 is a good focal length for travel, at least for me. One of the very first Sony lenses, Sony mirrorless lenses that I bought was the original Sony 1635 f4 Sony Zeiss lens, which I used for years and years. The reason I switched to the 1635 f4 is just like all new lenses, it's smaller, lighter, faster, and sharper. So it was an upgrade, in my opinion, over the previous lens. Not that the 1635 Sony Zeiss isn't still a very good lens. And that's an important thing when you're looking at photography. Just because a lens or a camera you have that's good today and tomorrow something else comes out, it doesn't mean that just because there's something better available that what you have isn't as good as it was before. But there are reasons to upgrade. So for me, smaller, lighter, faster, sharper, those are reasons to upgrade. Everybody's got a different requirements. So the 1635, very versatile wide angle lens. And because this one's smaller, lighter, and faster, I went with that. So this was in Japan, the bamboo forest with the Alpha 7R5 and the 1635. It's a good, very wide angle lens. I'll talk about the 1224 as well in sort of the honorable mention section. And I really like the 1224 as well. But the 1635 is, because it's smaller and lighter, if I need to pack tight, it's a really good lens. It's also why I use the f4 and not the 2.8G Master 2. The 1635 2.8G Master 2, great lens, but it's not as small as the f4. So I went with the size, because generally with what I'm shooting, I don't necessarily need that 2.8. And if I do, I have another lens that will serve that purpose. This is in Yosemite. So at 16, you can really get that wide expanse. In Tokyo, handheld at half a second. The image stabilization on Sony is fantastic. So the 1635, great lens. People often talk about the holy trinity of professional lenses, which is just 1635, 2470 to 70 to 200. I use all of those, and I do think if you're only going to get 3 lenses, those will do almost everything for you. Although there are reasons to have other lenses, as we will discuss. All right, next, the Sony 24 to 70 2.8G Master 2. The very first Sony mirrorless lens that I bought was the 2470 f4 Sony Zeiss again, because the early lenses were the Sony Zeiss lenses, the first few. And I used that a ton. It was a great lens. I used it a lot. I did some magazine covers. I used it for jobs. I used it all over the place. And then when the 2470 2.8 G Master came out, the first one, I switched to that and I bought the 2470 G Master in part because of the 2.8. At this focal length, I really like the 2.8. Then a year or two ago, Sony came out with the 2470 2.8 G Master 2. And like all the second series, there's several G Master 2 lenses. Smaller, lighter, faster, just everything improved. And so I upgraded to that. It's a great, great lens. It's probably the lens I use the most just because of that versatility. When I'm shooting portraits, I can shoot wide, I can shoot tight, I can shoot full length, I can shoot headshots. I've got a lot of flexibility. And if I don't have a lot of time where changing lenses could be an issue, it does a lot. An important thing to think about too, if you're going to do something like the Alpha 9 III and it's 120 frames a second, there are certain lenses that will support that. And certain lenses just by their design were not as fast with the autofocus. And so they can't necessarily do full autofocus and full auto exposure at 120 frames a second. Something like the 2470 GM2 can. So when I'm using the Alpha 9 III and I want that speed, it can handle it. Like I said, great for portraits, fairly tight. But at 24 millimeters, still great for, a nice landscape. This is in Washington State, Squamish Falls. That lodge there was, I think, used in Twin Peaks. Really versatile. If you're only going to travel with one lens, it's worth considering. My daughter in Yosemite last summer. I had a Sony condo trip last year. And then even super tight 70 millimeters still works. In a perfect world, I prefer a little bit longer at the long end for portraits, which is where the next lens comes in. But 2470 is a really versatile, solid lens, and 2.8, hard to go wrong. So here we have the 24-105 f4G, and you might think, if I have the 2470, do I need the 24-105? I had that same question when the 24-105 came out. I tested it a little bit. I really liked it, but I felt like it was redundant with the 2470 original G Master at the time. So I didn't buy it. And then I was in Savannah, Georgia, taking pictures at night in the streets. And I had my camera on my tripod, and I put my tripod on my shoulder. And I had not put the camera on as tightly on the tripod head as I thought. And normally I would hold the strap as well as the tripod legs when I'm doing that, and I didn't. And the camera fell off the tripod and landed on the lens. And so my 2470 got broken. And at that time, I'm like, you know what? It's a focal length I use enough that getting the 24-105 as a backup, as a redundancy for the 2470 made sense. So when I sent the 2470 in for repair, which is where Sony Pro Support really comes in handy because they fixed it for me. When it broke, because of the way it landed, the camera was totally fine, but the lens was pretty damaged. So it took a little while to get the parts in. Like, I need this focal length, so I got the 24-105 as well. So that when I need that range, if something goes wrong with one lens or the other, I still have that option because I just use it too much to not have that choice. It's like on a shoot, if I'm on any substantial professional shoot, I bring two cameras just in case. I've never had a Sony camera fail, but somebody could knock it off a table, something could go wrong, anything's possible. And if it's a big enough job, I can't stop the shoot and say, oh, give me an hour, I've got to get in another camera. You've got to be prepared. So that's why I got the 24-105. And I often bring this if I'm traveling as opposed to the 2470, in part because they're similar in weight and size, even though you've got that extra 35 millimeters at the long end on the 105, because it's an f4 and not a 2.8. So the 2.8, anything that's 2.8 is going to be bigger and heavier typically than an f4, for example. So it's similar in size, but a little more versatile in the range. It isn't as fast as the G Master 2. The autofocus is not quite as fast. But most of the time for what I photograph, that doesn't matter. And it's not a 2.8. And there are times when I really wish I had that 2.8, but that's typically only in really low light situations. So 24-105, it's a great lens. If you're only going to get one lens, I think it's worth considering. This is in Yellowstone a few years ago. Portrait on a job. This was for an editorial shoot. More portraits, type portraits. I really like the 105 for portraits. 70 is good, but I prefer just a tiny bit longer, and that having that range above 70 is really nice. Not that the 24-70 doesn't do a great job, but that extra little reach is nice. All right, then I mentioned that trinity of lenses that everybody talks about. 70 to 200 2.8 GM 2. So the third lens I bought for Sony mirrorless, I switched to Sony mirrorless right when that Alpha 7R, the original one, came out. That was my first Sony mirrorless camera. Before that, I had the Alpha 850. Although with the Alpha 7R, I didn't switch to mirrorless as my primary camera until the Alpha 7R2, because the R2 really improved a lot of things on the R, which was a great camera, but a little slow. So the third lens I bought after the 24-70, Sony Zeiss, the 16-35 Sony Zeiss, was the 70 to 200 f4G, the first one. Again, I went with the f4 because it was a smaller and lighter. And so for travel, I liked having less weight. At the time, the 70 to 200 2.8G Master, the original one, wasn't out, I don't think, when I bought the 70 to 200G, but it did come out. I didn't switch because I liked the smaller and lighter. And then when the G Master 2 came out, it was, I believe, around 30% lighter than the original G Master 1. Same thing as before, smaller, lighter, sharper, faster. So at that point, I did upgrade and I bought this to replace my 70 to 200 f4G. And this is a fantastic lens. I do a lot of corporate headshots. I don't have them in here because they're not that interesting, guys and ties. And I use the 70 to 200 for that more than anything. Really a great lens, super fast, super sharp. Great for portraits, tight, wide. 70 is not that wide, so you need to back up, but it's a beautiful lens. And you don't even have to do portraits. So still life, splash. Great lens, 70 to 200. Then the last in the main section here is the Sony 200 to 600. Now, earlier I said I didn't need the 600 f4, and I don't need the 600 f4, but there are times when I like having that range. So the 200 to 600G, it's not as fast in aperture, obviously, as the f4. But it packs a lot of punch in a small body. 200 to 600 is a great range. 6.3 is not bad, especially with the high ISO performance of the Sony cameras these days. And it's a great it's a great zoom. We have a place up in Connecticut, and I typically leave this lens up there with a camera so that when I see something cool outside, I can photograph it. So for example, this deer I saw this weekend out on the lawn. I saw it out on the lawn. I went out, it ran away, but it's a 200 to 600. So I could still capture it even though it had moved further away than it was when I started. And with the optical steady shot, the stabilization in both the camera and the lens, this was handheld at 1/25th of a second, which is a pretty long exposure to handhold at 200 to 600. Same thing here. Turns out there wasn't one deer, there were three. So as I followed the one, I saw the one to the left there and then that one in the back. I think an overlooked thing with really long lenses is that they can be great for travel and landscape. I've used this example in other presentations I've done. I originally shot this much wider, so you saw the full expanse of the waterfall, but it just got lost in the landscape. So this tighter shot with the 200 to 600, much more dynamic in my opinion. Now, obviously, we're all adults and we can all disagree. Somebody else would shoot this a different way, and that's fantastic. It's a boring world if we all do things the same way. But as a travel and wildlife lens, that 200 to 600 is great. Or this a couple years ago, 4th of July, from the rooftop of our Brooklyn apartment, way down by the south end of Prospect Park, 200 to 600 to get the fireworks. All right, wasn't the 4th of July. I misspoke. This is New Year's because they don't do fireworks from the Empire State Building on the 4th of July. So for New Year's a few years ago, they had fireworks off the Empire State Building. And from the rooftop of our Brooklyn apartment building, I was able to get this shot with the 200 to 600, even though it's probably 6-7 miles away. Really, really a very versatile, useful lens. So those are the zooms I use the most. And there are other lenses I have, and I'll talk about them in a bit. But, everything I had to focus, right? This is go-to lenses. If I talk about every lens I own in depth, this becomes a very, very long presentation. So those are the zooms. I'm going to talk about the primes that I use the most. So for anybody who doesn't know, a prime lens is a lens with a single focal length, and a zoom is a lens with multiple focal lengths. So a range 24 to 70, 70 to 200, 60 to 35. I got the 35 GM. I haven't had it that long. I had the 35 1.8 prior to that. Because in looking at my metadata, I realized that for environmental portraits, I was at 35 millimeters a lot. So I thought, well, I should just get the 35 millimeter lens and have that option. Great lens, like all the G Masters, great weather sealing, sharp, super fast autofocus. Some turtles in Prospect Park. Subways. I haven't had it that long, so I don't have a lot of samples. And it was hard. I have tens of thousands of processed images, and trying to find stuff with specific lenses is more of a challenge than you would think. Then we have the Sony 40 millimeter 2.5G compact. So this lens, there's now 6 compact lenses. There's a 24, 40, 50, and then 3 zooms. We're sort of designed to go with originally the Alpha 7C, and now there's the Alpha 7C2 and the Alpha 7CR. I had the Alpha 7C, now I have this Alpha 7CR, which is a smaller full frame mirrorless camera. But it's the smallest, I believe, the smallest full frame mirrorless camera that's made. So it's a more compact camera. If you're just walking around traveling, it's great. And I went with the 40. I have the middle range zoom too, but the 40, because it's a little bit wide, but not super wide. It's very compact. I often have this camera in my backpack when I have an office in Manhattan, where I'm going from Brooklyn back to Manhattan. And just so if I see something interesting, I can take a picture. So I'm not using it really commercially much, not on assignments, but I do use it as oh, that's something cool. I want to take a picture, and I could take a picture with my phone. I also often have my RX 106 in my bag. I can do that, but I would rather do it with full frame. I mean, I think often, especially in low light, you take a picture with your phone because it's easy, but you wish you'd taken it with a real camera. So that's the 42.5. In the mornings in Manhattan, early mornings in Manhattan, even earlier mornings in Brooklyn. My daughter on the swing, on the way to B&H to pick up a cable. So the 40 is a great compact lens as just a walking around camera. The 50 1.2 G Master, prior to this, and actually still have the Sony 55 1.8 Sony Zeiss, also I think maybe the 4th Sony mirrorless lens I bought. Great lens, but that 1.2 is really nice, and obviously it's newer. Because it's newer, it's much faster autofocusing. I love the 51.2, beautiful lens. That 1.2 wide open is fantastic. So this is a portrait out in California at 1.2. Even for a studio, f4, 1.8, f2, just available light in Times Square in the middle of the night. Great lens. Sony 50 1.2, great lens. I have used it for tight portraits. It's a little wide for that for me, but it's not so wide that it's really a problem. It's a very 50 is a versatile and often used focal length for a reason. And then this is, I think, the sleeper lens. So this may get replaced for me soon, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the Sony 85 1.8, it's not G Master or G or Sony Zeiss. And for those of you who don't know, G Master is Sony's top of the line, best of everything, Pro series, and G and Sony Zeiss are also Pro, but maybe not the fastest everything, because if you put everything into a lens, it costs more money. So you've got to have tiers. Because I don't know about you, but I'm not made out of money, so I can't. There's lots of stuff I'd love to have that I don't. So the 85 1.8, you can see it's currently on sale, or at least I believe it's currently on sale. Last week it was for $548. It's a great compact lens, and I think it's one of the best lenses for the dollar that you can buy. Great lens. So this was a editorial portrait, editorial again, self-portrait during COVID. 85 1.8, I really would encourage anybody who photographs portraits, if the G Master 2 is out of your, either out of your price range, or if you just want something lighter and smaller, great lens. And then I wasn't sure if I wanted to put these in the go-to part or in the honorable mention part, but I think something that's often overlooked are the teleconverters. The Sony teleconverters don't work on every lens. So, for example, the original 70-200 f4G, they don't work on. The original 70-200 2.8 G Master, they do. So for the most part, the long lenses in the last several years, they should work on. But if you're looking, you definitely want to look it up. And the reason that they might not work on a lens is because you can see that bit that sticks out on top. If the lens wasn't designed to accommodate that, that will hit the back element. There just isn't the room, so they don't work with every lens. But what it does is it extends the range of a lens by 0.4. So if it's, say, the 70-200, at the long end, instead of being 200, it's now 280. You lose a stop, so the 1.4, you lose one stop of light. But it can be really cool. So here's a frog, just because it was cool. Who doesn't love frogs? 200-600 with the 1.4x teleconverter. And then there's the 2x teleconverter. Same thing, except with this, you lose two stops. But you gain twice the focal length. So the 200-600 becomes a 400-1200, for example. Or the 70-200 becomes a 140-400. So this is with the 70-200 2.8 G Master 2 with the 2x teleconverter on Orcas Island in the San Juans in Washington State. A bald eagle, a seabird, same thing. Same thing. Well, not the same thing, a different bird, but this was at Condo last week. This was me planning really hard to try and photograph the sun setting behind the Statue of Liberty and getting a bit of a cloudy day with the 100-400 and the 2x teleconverter. I think the teleconverters really are overlooked and can be really great. All right, so those are the main lenses. And the main of the main is the 1635, the 70-200, and the 2470. But there's other lenses I have that I really like, and I do use a fair bit, but not necessarily all the time. They're more for specific uses. So the 1224 f4G, the 100-400 G Master 14, 1.8 G Master 24, 90 macro, 100 STF, and the 135 G Master. So I'm going to go over those. The 12-24 G, I was a little bit torn whether I felt like I used this or the 1635 more. But because the 1635 f4 is smaller than the 1224 f4, I do use it more, because if I only have so much space or I can only carry so much, I'm going to bring the one that's smaller. But that extra 12 to 16 millimeters can really do some cool things. And I like this lens a lot. So this is Niagara Falls, the night of New Year's several years ago. If you go there in the middle of winter when it's really cold, it's not so crowded. And if you go out at night, it's even less crowded. But it looked really cool. This is Goblin Valley in Utah at 12 millimeters. It's a really dramatic focal length. Grand Canyon when I was doing my through hike. And another COVID portrait. Just putting the camera in the fridge. With 12 millimeters, with that really wide, you can really do some dramatic things. And the Grand Canyon again. So the 12-24, especially for landscapes, I think is a great lens. It does have a bulbous front element. So if you are somebody who uses a lot of filters, you have to get those really huge clamp-on things because you can't screw a filter into the front of it. But it's a great lens. The 100 to 400, 4.5 to 5.6 GM, also a great lens. I have both this and the 200 to 600, as you know. I use them for different things. If I need the reach, it's the 200 to 600. If 100 to 400 is enough, I'll use this because it's a little faster, in part because it's a G Master. So this is some sea line or seals in California. It's even great for portraits. I really like very long focal length portraits. Sun setting on the West Coast. And then we're going to get into some primes that are even more specific because the primes I don't use every day are very specific use cases. So the Sony 14 millimeter 1.8 G Master is a fantastic, beautiful lens. It has the bulbous front element, so same thing as the 12-24. If you're using a lot of filters, you've got to solve that problem. But it's a great lens. And for things like the night sky, it's fantastic because you can shoot at 1.8. You're not limited, the zooms, even at 2.8, that's a stop and a third more light that the 1.8 is bringing in. So you're able to have either a faster shutter speed, so you've got less movement in the stars, or a lower ISO, and both of those can be really important. And it's just a cool landscape lens in general, because that 14 is so wide, you can get dramatic looks. And things like this, I'm really a fan of doing things like this with wide angle lenses where, to me, this feels a bit like you're in a cave, but it's really an opening about this big in a rock wall. It's not very big at all, but because it's so wide, it gives that feeling of everything close is so much larger that you feel like you're in something totally different, which I really like. The 24 1.4 G Master, also great for stars if you don't need something quite so wide. So wide is the 14, and 1.4, you've got an extra, was that half a stop, 2/3 of a stop of light. And this, for example, I did in Yellowstone when the comet Neowise was in the sky, of Old Faithful with Neowise a few years ago. 24 G Master, beautiful lens. The 90 macro, there's also a 50 macro. I like the longer macro because there's a lot of things that I might want to photograph with a macro, and I want to be further from it, not closer to it. So I prefer a longer lens macro like the 90 macro here. There is a new version of the 70-200 f4. This is 70-200 f4.2. It's also a macro. I haven't experimented with that much, but I really like the 90 macro, also crazy sharp. And because all the newer Sony cameras have image stacking, not in camera, but it's got the focus bracketing so that you can shoot a bunch of images and then assemble it in post. So this, for example, was 35 images assembled in post of some moss, which I quite like. Single shot of a flower, some lichen, orchid, 27 frame image stack here. This is a 153 frame image stack of some fungus on a log that I just thought looked cool. This is a fine example of, I don't want my macro to be too short because I don't want to be too close to what I'm photographing. This is, I believe, an orchard spider, but I had to look it up. And I'm fine with spiders for the most part, but I still don't want to be right on top of them. Plus, you don't want to disturb things too much if you can avoid it. So single shot. Then we have the 100 STF. This is a beautiful lens. I think it's often overlooked. The STF stands for smooth transition focus. And what it does is it affects the bokeh of the shot. So if you're shooting wide open, or up to 5.6. So it's an f2.8 lens, but the t-stop, which is the amount of light that's actually transmitted, is 5.6. The physics of a thing, t-stop and f-stop are not the same. F-stop is a formula and t-stop is an actual measurement. It has filters and things in the lens to affect the bokeh, but it gives you this really smooth out of bokeh drop off. So all of these that say at 5.6, the lens it's at 2.8, but the light is 5.6. So it's a little hard to explain. But if you look at just how the hair drops off, the out of focusness, I think it's really, really beautiful. The 135-1.8 is a fantastic, beautiful portrait lens. You need space, obviously, because 135 is quite long. But especially at 1.8, I love it. Another Sony or COVID portrait. During COVID, I did a self-portrait every day for 87 days or something. So that's why there's a lot of examples, because I was trying to do new things. And then what am I looking at next? Next, I am considering the 85 1.4 G Master, which they announced last week at Sony Condo Trip in California. And because I was fortunate enough to be there, I was able to try out the lens. And I really like it. So that's 85 1.4 G Master, shipping, I think, the end of September. This was with the Alpha 9 III with the strobe. That's why it's at 10,000th of a second, because the Alpha 9 III, you can boost your shutter speed because there's no limit to the sync speed and still shoot shallow. I like out of focus foreground elements. So the 85 1.8 was a really, really nice lens. I'm also looking at the 300 2.8. I'm finding that things like the deer and birds and stuff, I'm more and more interested in photographing. The 300 is a compromise. The 600 and the 400 are beautiful lenses. I wouldn't use them enough. The 300, I think I could. I've only used it a little bit. When I was testing out the Alpha 9 III shortly before it became available, the 300 was also announced at the same time, so I was able to try them both. And 300 2.8 is it's a really nice focal length. I really, really like it. All right, let's see if there are any questions.
Man, that 300 2.8 is.
I was sure it was going to be my next lens, and then the 85 1.4 came out.
I know it's a tough focal length to justify when the price is a little higher and that's not your bread and butter lens.
But I could use it for portraits.
You could
I
use it
like,
for that.
yeah. So,
We'll
but
just-
it's, you know,
We'll schedule 5 more photo walks throughout the year,
there you go.
all in parks.
And we can really put it through its paces.
There you go.
I'll just tell Sony I need to borrow it for these photo walks coming up.
It's work.
Yeah,
That's it. We'll put in a good word.
there you go.
Great information as always, Tony. Looks like no questions. So if anyone does think of anything, we have all of Tony's contacts up here. You know where you can always find him. If not from this list, he's always here. Or part of the time. I feel like we're gonna have to get him on the payroll soon if we have him on anymore. But huge thank you as always, Tony. Any closing words?
Thanks everybody. Hope to see some of you at the photo walks coming up.
Likewise, I'll be there Thursday, so hopefully we see some of our tri-state crowd. And that's all we got for you today. Another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space now in the books. Catch you
Thanks
next time.
everybody.